Welcome everyone to our Global Initiatives Network Akuhawai Roundtable webinar. This is a conversation about the impact of virtual spaces on student communities, focusing on residential communities, but also thinking about campus and other spaces for students. My name is Elizabeth Cox, and I will be moderating this panel. I work for Basecamp Student. We are a private student housing developer and operator in Europe. We call it a PBSA company, and we have residences in Germany, Poland, and Denmark. And we have about 4,000 beds. So that's my role at Basecamp is chief of staff. But we have a great group of panelists here today to kind of facilitate this conversation. So I'm going to have them introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about what they do and who they are. And we'll start in the order of my screen. So James, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you. So my name's James. I'm the head of residential life at the London School of Economics. I've actually only been there about a year, so I would say still new to the role-ish. We have about 4,500 students that live in residences, all within central London. So I take responsibility for making sure those students are happy and that our halls are running as they should do. Alongside that, I'm also the chair of the residential life part of Cubo, which is a UK association, very similar to a QOI, but on a smaller version just in the UK. And I get involved with the QOI through the Global Initiatives Network and currently serve as the UK ambassador for that. So that's me. Thank you, Elizabeth.
And Charlie.
Hello, everyone. My name is Charlie Clausen, and I'm the Assistant Dean of Residence Life at Duke Kunshan University in China. I serve as the Senior Residence Life Officer, and we have an operation that's about 1,000 beds currently, working our way up to about 2,200 in the next year or so as our enrollment grows, since we are only a 5-year-old institution. And I too am involved, like James, in the Akuhawai and serve as a global ambassador for China.
And our next guest is not a part necessarily of the Akuhawai community, but a part of the tech community. So Kunal.
Hi, hello everyone. My name is Kunal. I'm the head of sales and partnerships at Spaceflow. At Spaceflow, we build tenant experience and student experience platforms, and working across the BTR sector, the PBSA sector, as well as commercial and broader multifamily housing. We've been around since 2016. I am relatively new to the prop tech field, just north of a year, just slightly above a year. And prior to that, I have been extensively into real estate development and then facilities management. So I can sort of bring some perspective to what the end users and the operators and the developers are looking for. And that's where I bridge that gap between the tech teams and the operation teams on site. Fantastic. But yeah, excited to be here, and I mean, not an expert as yet, but curious, and I think it's an amazing playground to just think and be creative about how we can really make a big difference with the meeting of virtual communities and in-person communities. Great. Look forward to it.
Thank you. And our final panelist is Katarina.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Katarina, I am from Fraunhofer Institute in Stuttgart, Germany. Fraunhofer Institute, it's a big research institute. We have different topics where we are researching in. My main focus was on new work topics. From the background, I'm an architect, and I was working more in the interior design of new office environments. So what we need in the future. And I have to say that Corona was a really interesting time for us, because somehow everything changed, and we had a lot of companies coming in who were asking us, okay, what are we doing right now? We have the virtual world and we have the real world, and we can work from everywhere. So how can we manage all these worlds together? And we worked a lot about hybrid meeting spaces. I was also part of a network which is called Future Meeting Space. And there, of course, virtual communities, virtual networks were a big topic as well. So yeah, right now I'm more in the urban scale in an innovation network, which is called Future Hotel. Also super interesting topics, also about Metaverse in the moment. We are getting some VR classes. We already have some in our office to yeah, make some field research with ourselves. I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm very happy to be part of the group this morning.
Thank you. And so actually, I think that's a really good transition, Katarina. And so I'll actually start off the conversation with you, and kind of as you have looked across all of the different aspects of your work, how do you define community, and how do you see that defined in different ways in what you're doing in your research?
Well, I think it's kind of interesting to take a look to the historical part of communities, not to go back like 100 years or more, but some generations before us. I think community was pretty much based on blood somehow, on our families, because the radius of action was somehow very small. So normally the people stayed in their little villages, in their surroundings, and the basic family was somehow the most important community, and also maybe the neighborhood around. And when we are comparing this with our communities from today, some aspects really changed. So in the moment we are traveling a lot, we are living in different countries and cities, and the network which we are building, it's much more complex. And I think it's not based on the family core anymore, or not only. It's more based on values, for example. It's based on the same topics which we are sharing, on maybe hobbies, or on all the interests which we have, so more the soft factors. And I think this is the big difference in the moment when we're talking about community, that we are able to choose our own community. And so that's how we are defining it at the moment. We are also speaking about global communities, global networks, because it's getting much more complex than some years ago.
Absolutely, thank you. And so, Charlie, as you are in a community that is still dealing with COVID lockdowns, and as someone who is an expat running a university in China, what does community look like where you are and in your student residences?
Yeah, it means a whole lot for us, in particular in China, in higher education, and in my university being a new one. We also are about 30% international student. But when the coronavirus started just as an epidemic about 3 years ago, the borders were sealed off. And so we have been trying to launch our startup university while COVID is going on, and while 30% of our student population has been unable to get to our physical campus. Definitely not what we had planned, but we had to zoom out and think about what is community, and how do we create that, thinking about space and opportunity for connections. And so space, we've used a whole lot more different types of platforms, whether that's, just Zoom Hangouts, or WeChat is a very popular kind of everything app in China, if you're familiar with that. And so trying to get groups of students together there. We work to try and do some time zone based initiatives where we group students who maybe are in Europe and Africa, and so they're maybe geographically far apart, but time zone they are together, and trying to find a way to get them connected while our space is mostly in the virtual realm as far as the intercultural connections we're trying to foster. The opportunities can still be the same. And so we have still encouraged people to get to know their roommates, for example. One of our policies is to have domestic students have an international roommate for their first first year. That's by design, to create a community that really is global in nature. And we can definitely talk a whole lot more, but it really has forced us to zoom out and rethink some of those spaces, and ways to engage and create those opportunities to help people experience humanity together, to help people experience relationships together, even though we may be time zones apart, and geography, we may be very apart.
Yeah, I think that, you know, what you both talk about, I think is really interesting, because the time zone thing, right? Even I think that, you know, Katarina, as you talk about community really being about kind of more blood tribal in nature, as from a historical perspective. Now, you know, it's not, you know, as we think about it, it's not just topical, but it's also practical. I mean, even looking at this webinar, right, and the multiple time zones that we have to navigate. And so, and then, you know, what are the boundaries that creates around the communities, but also where do things open up? And so, you know, I think that and then that you talked about kind of the virtual, you're seeing a lot of interaction on the virtual spaces, Charlie. But Kunal, I'm going to ask you a question next and say, where are you seeing, from the tech perspective, where are you seeing kind of that intersection between the virtual spaces and the kind of in real life or analog spaces from your perspective? Yeah.
Well, with regards to, and I'll just continue on the point Charlie made, where students want to, you know, get to know their colleagues before they come on campus, and that's where a few of our clients are actually using our technology the same way. Where as soon as you sign up as a student, you're given access to download the platform, and you're already onboarded with all the welcome package and other things which I've put onto the document dashboard, for example. But what's more important is I could browse through the other university students who are going to be around at the same time. And these are usually the first year students, because how it traditionally works is the first year, they're sort of new to the place, they're a little unsettled, they find friends, and then they move out into private housing in the second year and the third year. So keeping that same perspective in mind, you can actually do this much before and go through profiles, and it helps you populate interests, hobbies. For example, I'm a runner, and, you know, I want to know which are the other runners on campus, so that when I'm there on campus, I can probably stay around in the same dorms with them, and then create events and populate events and posts and sort of build that community. So we already seeing that happen, where it's blending and the lines are blurring. But I think more importantly, the definition of virtual communities and in-person communities. In-person communities have certain, I wouldn't say limitations, but sorry, I'll just take a step back. With regards to community definition, it's something that you perceive as common interests or aspirations, and then you find a sense of belonging. That's how I define a community these days. Now, the difference between virtual and in-person is virtual can be a broader sort of aspiration. So I try to think of virtual communities as something that is aspirational for me, which can be much wider, but in-person communities will eventually get categorized into more functional communities, which may not always be aspirational. So that's where sort of in my head, I draw a line. And I mean, you can blend your technology that way. An example there would be a functional task, which is now very popular, is when you receive a parcel as a student, right? Mm-hmm. Now you've got smart parcels. Earlier, you had someone come to your door or come to the concierge desk below and deliver it for you. Now, that's a functional task, which there's been an added digital layer with a lot of smart parcel companies, which are, you don't need to interact with anyone. Now, people are okay with that because it's a functional task. You don't necessarily want to meet someone for a functional task. But with aspiration, what we've seen is, yes, you've got people all over the globe that you're friends with and you've got common interests with, and you want to meet them from time to time. But when you meet them, you're seeing conversations being less vague now and more specific. So that's been sort of a trend that we've seen coming out of COVID, where people are happy with their interactions online, and when they want to meet, it's for specific tasks.
Interesting. James, are you seeing that as you look at your students at LSE?
Yeah, I mean, Kunal mentioned about the pre-arrival and getting to know students, and I think that's been a trend probably for the past 5 to 10 years that's been getting kind of stronger and stronger, that students are finding their tribe before they arrive. And that's fantastic, because it means that when the communities arrive and they're in their halls, it's a stronger community because they already know each other. Although at LSE we don't have all the fancy technology that Kunal just mentioned, we use WhatsApp to create groups for each of our halls. It's really interesting to see that, and it's really interesting to see that the students have already Googled each other. They're connected on LinkedIn, they're connected on Instagram. They really know the people they're going to be living with inside out almost, because everybody's got a social profile in some way. So that's been really interesting to see, and a few others just touched on that post-pandemic experience now. Very different, I know, in the UK, and we're slightly different in terms of other countries in terms of how we work with the pandemic right now, but we're in that transition period of going from virtual to doing much more in person. I would say most of our operations now are in person, and most of our social and interaction work is in person with a bit of blended. We learned a lot, I think, during the pandemic, and especially for universities that can move quite slow, I would say, to make some of these changes. That pandemic actually helped with pushing some of that work forward at speed, which for me as a young person was a delight to see at the time. Some of the things I've been asking for and some of the technologies were just brought on board overnight, whereas, you know, naturally that would take years usually actually to get approval in a university to do that. And some of the things I think that we thought would stay, like the quizzes and the online things that we did during the pandemic, actually haven't. You know, students don't actually want that, and I don't think we want that in our personal lives either. We're craving that in-person experience. So I think it's about finding that balance around what works for your institution. Some very small changes we've made recently at LSE is that we used to have an office for the admin side of housing, so the students could come along. We've got a campus and all of our halls are within walking distance of the campus. They could come along for an appointment to talk about their application or finances, etc., etc. We've actually closed that office because of Zoom. We saw a massive rise in Zoom appointments, and students just wanted that. They preferred that over anything else. They would take email or Zoom as a preferred contact method. And then we just saw that students weren't coming at all to the office, so we ended up closing it, which I think is radical for a university to shut an in-person office. But really interesting to see. And actually we're just doing what the students or the customer wants and what they're asking for, which I think is really important.
So sorry, I think that, you know, you bring up this idea, and Kunal, you mentioned it, you know, for the whole group to chime in here around kind of functional versus social in some ways. Is that the right dichotomy? And you know, do you see it being a balance of both? Do you see kind of, you know, is it contextual? Does it depend? But so, you know, as organizations or as universities, as companies decide where to invest, you know, their time, their talent, and their treasure, should it be focused on the functional or should it be focused on the social? And what does that look like? So I'll let whoever wants to start with that one. Katarina, do you have any thoughts on that in your work?
Well, when I see it from the office perspective, somehow it was very interesting to hear the conversation, because we have somehow the same conversation. We see that every way to the office and every decision which we are making to go, or every day which we are spending in the office, it's made on a really conscious decision, because we have alternatives. And so when we are going to the office and when we want to meet in person, it should be a big value behind somehow. It's something very specific, and so I think this is the challenge, but also the chance which we have right now with the virtual world, that we have a lot of alternatives how to work or how to meet other people. But when we want to meet in person, it should be an explosion, a firework, and we really want to have an emotional experience behind. So, and to create that, I think the functional tools, like to meet the people in LinkedIn before or in TikTok or whatever, so in the social platforms, I think it's a really, really interesting tool to also select somehow the people with whom I want to meet in person. But I see also maybe a big challenge in that, or also the danger that we have some bubbles maybe in the future, very homogeneous communities with less diversity, because I think that we are running into a time where we want to have a lot of security, and safetyness is very important, and maybe and we don't want to make the risk anymore to also meet some people with another opinion, with another point of view, and this could be maybe also a risk. I just to mention another point of view. Yeah,
Absolutely. I think it's a good point. Anyone have a response or something else they want to add?
I was just going to add, from an events perspective too, we've got Res Life people that run events, and I think that it's always important if you're doing real life things, to, if it's big and it's a big powerful event, I think it's always good to have some form of digital aspects to that, because it's just much more inclusive, and there's, you know, for various needs, people can't always commute in to attend something, and actually some people don't feel confident doing that. They'd rather join the session on a one-way Zoom, and that's absolutely fine. So I think for us, we're trying to find that balance of what works for everybody and includes everybody, but also logistically, we've had some big speakers recently. LSE, we've had the president of the World Bank, the first lady from Ukraine came over to do a talk, and we just can't fit the numbers into some of the rooms for those talks because they're in such high demand. So we have to have that digital feed alongside, and also it just creates this excitement globally. We can feed that feed out around the world. Why not? Shout about what we're doing. So there's lots of benefits there, but I think it's about finding that balance of what works for your community and includes everybody in that community, so nobody feels left out. Yeah.
I think one of the
sorry, go ahead, Charlie. Go ahead.
Charlie, and then Kunal. Yeah.
Okay. Kind of building off James and Katarina, what you both said, one of the things that we've been doing is trying to do our best at doing the one size fits all, and that can be open if we've got something that we think fits that. And I've also challenged us to think, you know, if that's not working, let's go ahead and pivot. And if there's something that we want to do, for example, we wanted to do a day of kayaking and stand-up paddleboarding with our RA training. And when we got to the point in the summer where we knew, again, that the border was going to be closed, so international students wouldn't be able to come, again, we had to balance that question of, you know, is something worth doing separate? What things can we do in that space that everybody's able and it's meaningful, and what things are okay? It really can be more meaningful just in the virtual space, because, okay, you're international, you've got that in common, you've got, you know, maybe some visa concerns or things like that. What things are most appropriate for the kind of everyone space, and what things can we kind of tailor, and then that way, whether it's in the Zoom for people who are all in that same experience, we can really hit them with something good that really makes sense and resonates with that community. And when we are able to do, or when we do elect to do something that's fully in person, let's put a bang to it. Let's make it good. Let's make it worth its while in being physically present together, when and how we can. So that's kind of both of those things. We've been asking ourselves which things need to fit in each of those buckets, and how can we serve students well.
Yeah, Kunal.
Yeah, so I'd like to think of sort of online communities that never meet more as forums,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
Versus people meeting in person as sort of more towards the community side of the definition. But I think from an organizational standpoint, it's very important to categorize that if you're creating events or spending money on interacting with forums versus actual communities, you need to manage your expectations on, you know, what you want from which one. And I think that would define how you spend your money. So
Yeah.
So it's important to have the distinction and categorization.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think this idea of forums versus communities is a really interesting conversation around that. And so I also have a question for the group. not prepare, not to, don't worry about, but we're using, I think, language matters here. And so, actually in writing the questions and thinking about this, right, there's in real life, Katarina, you talk about digital versus analog. What are the different phrases that we should be using? Because for someone who is, someone who is maybe unable to connect in a community in, face-to-face physical presence with each other, maybe that online aspect is still real life to them. It's just a different place. So what is the language that we should be using around this? Thoughts? Can in real life mean, because I think we traditionally use it as kind of, it's the differentiator between what's online, right, and what is kind of physical presence. And so,
and there's that in between too, I think, as well, just to add in that we've got that
hybrid.
Yeah, hybrid, and some people use hybrid. Some in the UK we use blended approach. We use blended, especially within the academic world. We use the word blended. We don't tend to use the word hybrid, but I see that different in each country. So it's quite interesting to hear that. IRL is a term used, I would say, in the UK with younger communities, and it's a trendy acronym, really, I guess. I like it. But for older generations, maybe not. So it's interesting. I think that you've got that difference across each country, but also you've got differences across different generations too. And I think we have to be conscious of that too.
I think that's true. And if the populations that we're working with are using different language and then we mean different things, that could be a challenge. What are you guys seeing? Are you seeing kind of consistency around the language in your different areas, and what are the terms being used in regards to this? Katarina, what are you seeing? I know you talked about kind of the work that you do around digital versus analog, and kind of when you say analog, is that kind of what we call in real life? How do you see those terms?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. We are mostly talking about hybrid worlds in the moment. I think hybrid is the big trend word. We are also speaking about geographical spaces and virtual spaces to make clear that it has a geographical order somehow in the real world. I don't know. But yeah, it's difficult, and I think in the future maybe we are not speaking about digital and analog anymore, because I can see it already in the architecture field that when we are building new buildings, it's coming more and more up that you're also thinking during the planning and developing the real building, you're thinking about the virtual space. It means that you're thinking about sensoric, for example, you're thinking about including digital screens and touchpads or whatever, so to have an entrance somehow to the virtual world. And this is an interesting development also in the architecture field, that the two worlds are getting closer together. And I think in the future, this gap, it's maybe not really there anymore.
Okay.
Yeah, and if I may add, on what Katarina said there, it's the blending of the worlds, and that's where the metaverse in a way kicks in, where a large part of the language barrier, or the lingo barrier, if you call it, can sort of dissipate, because if you have got a virtual avatar, it adds to the body language feature of an in-person interaction. And the assumption here is, and which may not always be correct, is that my virtual avatar would be like how I am in person.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there'll be people who will not put that up, but that's again a different topic, right?
Yeah.
But I think that in a way helps with creating that bond.
Yeah.
Because it's adding the body language perspective to it, and it's an interesting space, because then I could just pop in for a coffee with a friend in the virtual world where we're sitting and talking. And you're already seeing some companies conduct meetings that way, where you're sitting in sort of a digital twin of your conference room, and you're not just seeing people across Zoom, but you're seeing actual avatars sitting across a table and talking to each other. So it's interesting what sort of technology can bring in over here.
Yeah, and I think that even as you think about the buildings, right? So, there's a lot of conversation in the student accommodation world around common spaces and the role of common spaces. And those common spaces cost money to build, right? They also cost money to heat and to have electricity. And so, does this mean, in the future, is there a time where maybe there are not kind of common spaces, but then there are these connection points to the digital common space, right? And so to your point where it's like, you don't have a party room, but you have a virtual party room, right? So is it cheaper to build? It's a lot cheaper to clean, that's for sure. But there's still something, I mean, as a student housing person, that still makes me like irk a little bit, because that's still, there's still the human need. I mean, we're still kind of social creatures in that human need. But do you think that there could be a trend where it impacts, like Katarina was saying, it impacts the way that we build?
I think it's already happening. I think that's already in the pipeline. I know we're working on some big builds for the LSE in the next few years in London, one of them being the biggest building in Europe for student accommodation once it's built. So we have to get that right, and we have to do it future-proofed almost.
Yeah.
So we're thinking at the moment that we're not going to have that central common room, that supersized room, which we do have at the moment in some of our halls. We're seeing a trend over the past few years that students don't really need or want that anymore. They want maybe mini hubs throughout the building, which creates smaller communities. I think well-being wise, it would also be a bit of a disaster probably for us to create one super size room for that large of a community over over 1,000 students. It's not healthy, and it's quite scary, I think, for some students. So for us to create mini common rooms, many study spaces throughout the building, and create sub communities, I think will work better. And then to add on to that, we'll probably be creating sub digital communities too that supplement those many communities, so they'll meet in person or they could meet online, and we're going to give them the tools and the options to do that. But I think we're seeing a move away from that much more traditional super common room or super bar or whatever it is you might have in your hall of residence, to something that's a bit more inclusive for everybody.
Yeah.
Just building off that, what James had said is we're about to open about 2,100 beds in the next 5-6 months. And that's exactly it. They rather than the model that might have been used, we operate very American style in student affairs and student accommodations, even though we're in China. And so 40 years ago, you build a giant 500-600 student building, but we're doing it much smaller. We've got 200 and 300 total occupancy buildings. And then just like James said, rather than we do have one large social space, but then lots of small team rooms, because we recognize that's more the way students are interacting.
Yeah. So I want to be conscious of time. So as we kind of another kind of big question for us to answer here is, as you look into the future and you kind of, you talked about the buildings that you're opening next 5 or 6 months, or the buildings that you're building in next 5 or 6 years. And, there's a lot of conversation, particularly I think in Europe right now, around the student experience and what the experience of places where people stay, whether that is in places where people sleep, whether that is a student residence, whether that's co-living, whether that's a hotel. But as you kind of look in your crystal ball in 10 years, right, what do you see as the kind of the intersection points? Will they be the same as they are today? Will they be different? Is there going to be, where will we see the money and the time invested? Where will people kind of meet? Thoughts? And we'll start here with, I'm going to go with James. We'll start with James, and we'll kind of go throughout the panel.
I would like to see that some of the offerings that we've got digitally, and maybe some of the software as well that we offer to support students is more centralized. Even in my own home, it drives me insane that I've got a smart meter on one app, I've got something else on another app. If I want to turn a light on, that's another app. Why can't all of this be in one? It just infuriates me almost. So I think it would be nice to see that in student accommodation too, that they can do everything, their access card, their lighting, their wellbeing management. Maybe they can book an appointment with a wellbeing advisor all through one single app for their hall. And I think that would just be ideal, that we simplify and make that service as simple as we can. I think, you know, over many years with lots of different companies and involved, we've over-engineered it maybe slightly to try and make it better for the customer or the student, but actually we've made it, I think, a bit more challenging. So I would like to see that we simplify it and we make that experience straightforward. Although I did say this about 5, maybe even about 10 years ago, that I'd like to see one app for housing. 10 years on, we're not quite there. So let's see.
Maybe it will happen. Katarina, what are your thoughts? Did you look into your crystal ball?
I would love to have a crystal ball. It's kind of super hard sometimes because we are working with future scenarios and forecasts, but in the end, something like Corona happens and then it's like another way again, which we are taking. But all in all, generally, I would like to have more braveness maybe for the experimental way to make experience also with the metaverse, with NFTs, with all the new topics. I think it's important that we don't have the solution yet, right? We cannot even define what is metaverse and what kind of impact does it has in the future. But at least we can take the first step to think about, to discuss. I think an exchange in the interdisciplinary way, it's very important to also talk with others, to go out from the bubble and to find new solutions and to see it as maybe also more like an experiment in a good way. And that's what is my general wish for it. And for student housing, I think it's true. I think emotional experience between human, it's still the most important thing in the geographical, analog, whatever world. But I think that the virtual space, especially metaverse, it can be a big impact on global communities to connect also with others, and as a super interesting tool to increase our communities in a good way. And so yeah, that's my general wishes for the future.
Yeah, I think two interesting points there. I think, you know, the kind of courage, the braveness that we want to see to innovate and be more experimental. And I think in student housing, it's kind of ironic because universities are often places of innovation and places to do those experiments. And you've got this group here, and students are often the ones who are the future of that research. But then universities are also kind of, from a business perspective, pretty conservative in the way that they operate. So there's an interesting tension there, I think, as well. And so I think I really appreciate that. Kunal, what are your thoughts about kind of where things will be?
Well, actually, you know, just picking up on what James said, and this is at the risk of a sales pitch, but it's not, you know, that's exactly what we do with regards to becoming the consolidated front-end experience platform, right? And we integrate into all the various back-end systems which you've worked on over the last 10 years and the over-engineering, and we try to simplify it through integrations. And we're working with people on those lines to, you know, just bring in efficiencies. However, you know, looking into the crystal ball into 10 years, I think most of the tech is already available. It's just going sort of mile deep within it. An example of that would be where you've got, you know, students already looking at each other's profiles, either through WhatsApp or through, you know, our experience platforms, and identifying who they want to spend more time with on campus once they're there in person. With regards to Metaverse blending into something as simple as that, how I would see it is there's digital twins of universities, where as a student, I could actually select the type of decor I want in my room and, you know, who's going to be sharing it with me. I already have that person's avatar with me and we're seeing the property together.
Yeah.
Right. We're seeing campus together.
Yeah.
So again, you know, this is, I think it again cuts back to earlier into the conversation where we had online classrooms 15 years back. I remember in university, I was a student assistant conducting online classrooms as my part-time job. So, but it wasn't really used in a large sort of in a broader way till COVID hit. So I think the universities, schools, and especially the PBSA operators, it's a booming industry, right? There's always going to be more demand, and we've been hearing about that in the UK more than anything else right now.
Yeah.
And there are more students than beds available. So I think there will be it has to be sort of, they have to drive that innovative changes. It's there, it's available. And James, for what you're looking at, we should surely connect after this, and I'll be happy to run you through whatever anyone else and we can do. But I think most of the stuff is there. I think the next 10 years is just going to be about incorporating it into our sort of systems and processes and the lifestyle of students.
Yeah.
And yes, there will be sort of add-on technologies like NFTs, but the functionality over there right now with NFT is that it's in a way a digital code that identifies documents, and the same can be applied to access cards into the future, because you've got Salto and HID and Accessy and NSPS companies, which with Salto and these companies we've integrated where their digital card comes up onto our app. So you have one place where you have all of it. Now, it could be coded with NFT in the future, right? So that's the only change I see. And then of course, people, because they're living or will live their virtual lives in the metaverse, you're going to see concerts happening there, which is already happening with certain artists, with ad space around those concerts. So I think as universities and as operators, it's good to experiment with events in the metaverse and see what the uptake is. And then maybe after one event, pull in some sponsors into that space and see how the response is, because you can only try. You can't really have an answer right now because everyone's as curious about it and it's unknown for everyone.
True. Thank you. Charlie.
My crystal ball is very, very cloudy. The last 3 years have reminded me of that. So, but when I do look in there, looking at something that maybe is wild and sounded even more wild just 3 years ago. Like we mentioned, I think spaces like the metaverse are going to make sense. I think as costs rise for living on campus for students, I think as a lot of students have experienced a lot of online learning or hybrid learning in the last number of years, and since they stay the same age, but they keep their lives before even getting to the university are so much more integrated with technology every year when they get to the university. I think universities will start looking at how they can use technological resources like the metaverse. I think looking at models, even for undergraduates, like academic models that fit more like an executive education model, like we might know, where people every month come for like a weekend or something like that. That would enable you to be more space optimized with limited on-campus accommodations that you might have. You could just bring certain groups in periodically for them to get the in-person or face-to-face experience. But then if you're supplementing that with metaverse, then there's also great opportunity, like you said, Kunal, to have a room with your roommate. You can pick your walls. I know half the students that I've ever worked with in my entire career would love the opportunity to just click and change the wall color and then not get billed for it at the end of the semester. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for rethinking academic scheduling and structuring, and more use of technology, that freshmen of every class that we keep going are going to be more and more comfortable and just socialized and normalized in general, having technology just being more and more a part of their life than we've seen in the past.
Yeah, and I think, Kunal, you said, you think everything's there and it's how we integrate it into the world. I mean, I can remember probably 10 or 12 years ago, president of a university getting up and talking about MOOCs. Those are kind of, the can't remember what it exactly stands for, but the open online courses type of deal, and the kind of threat that that had for in-person higher education. And what we've seen is that, you know, really these things that we think are going to take over one thing don't actually do that in a way that we really, I think, anticipate as a society. And so I think it's the same here. But I think also all of the things that you talk about, and probably another conversation for this would be, what are the skills that we have to have as people in the industry working with these younger generations to keep up with them? Because, you know, my 5-year-old niece is better at digital stuff than I am, and this is just the way that she's grown up with it. And so so what does that mean, and how we have to kind of change the way that we work in those things? That could probably be a whole other conversation. I know Katarina is kind of in the new world of future of work type of things. We've started to have that different conversations, but it does bring up the question around kind of competencies and skills, and whether it's student accommodation, whether it's you know, real estate, facilities management, all of these things that are part of what we do. Everything from conferences, meeting planning, catering, food and beverage. You know, are we prepared? Right? It's no longer cash registers and point of sales and property management systems. It's everything. So, well, good. Well, you know, I'm not sure if there are any questions from the audience. Matt, if you have any any final questions.
I just posted something there, and I apologize. I did have to step out for a bit, so I'm sure I'm excited to listen to the full discussion that you all had, because I think this is so interesting. But I don't want to be redundant, but the comment, just Elizabeth, to your question, I think the skills, thinking about the older generation, but similarly, I mean, my daughters are 15 and 17, and so I've already been lapped. So it's not only like I'm one iteration behind, it's like multiple, where I'm not really doing Snapchat or Instagram, and they're like, well, those are old anyway. I'm like, okay, well, what's next? And they're like, Discord. And I was like, okay, well, that's way beyond my capabilities. But I do wonder, so there's a skill element, but then there's also a mindset element, I feel like, you know, to the extent that older generations, and I guess for me, Gen X, but, you know, like that we're open to seeing it differently. So not seeing these virtual communities as a threat, where we could think like, well, we're student housing or we're student accommodation. We literally need a physical location, but how can we see it as augmenting or supplementing or enhancing what we're doing, and not as a competition, which it could be. You know, I think as students move to looking for less expensive higher education, living on campus is one of the most expensive things. And so kind of thinking, how do we blend these together, where there still will be, you know, I think a desire for an on-campus experience, but how do we still pull elements of that for others that aren't able to maybe afford that, or whatever reason aren't able to get there. So I think it requires like a full paradigm shift and mindset shift to be able to encourage this and not slow down the youth, I guess, or the younger generation coming out.
I think you have to think about that as well in terms of recruitment and your talent going forward, and making sure that you're recruiting the right staff with an open mind and willingness to accept change and accept a new way of working. And that doesn't mean that you have a whole young staff force, because anybody at any age can be open-minded. But that will create that healthy bunch of talent, really, to push forward new innovation. And the last thing you want is anybody blocking that or not quite understanding it. And maybe that's just re-education as well of your existing staff force to bring people up to speed with the new world or the new way of working. So that's healthy, I think, for everybody.
Yeah. It's really just about kind of, as was mentioned earlier, just kind of us being brave in the space and really trying to be more proactive in the conversations, which is what this conversation was meant to be. Because I think we often talk about it in solutions, right? There's the access solution, there's the meeting solution, but we rarely have a chance like this to talk about it from a grander scale and think about how does this overall interact and impact a lot of the different aspects of the areas that we work with, and kind of whether it's on the private side or the university side or the kind of you know, the partner side with different stakeholders. So great conversation. I just want to thank all of you again for coming, and really, I think, really starting, I think what hopefully will be more conversations in this sector about the importance of this and what this means going forward for anyone in the accommodation world. So again, big thanks to ACUOI for hosting this. Big thanks to our panels. For those of you who are listening to the recording, thank you. And if you have any questions or would like to get in touch with any of us, please reach out via ACUOI or LinkedIn. Thank you.